featured as a nurturing mother, but also as a beastly monster. And so my main chapters are divided into chapter 1 is the ghost, chapter 2 is the vampire and the monster, chapter 3 is the witch and the gypsy, and chapter 4 is the trance dancer and the medium. And so today we're going to just talk a little bit about the occult and the new woman and representations of female vampires in psychology, fiction, and film. This will be around 20-ish minutes, and then we can take questions. I'll flip through some of these slides as we go as well. Let's see, let me do this slideshow. Okay. With 10 million war dead, the newly developed weapons of mass destruction employed in World War I became symbolic of evils of the scientific rationality in the popular consciousness. For disillusioned members of Weimar society, the occult represented an alternative system for conceptualizing the natural world. This interest in the occult was already emerging at the end of the 19th century in the period from the late 1800s to the Nazi era in 1933. And there were over 200 clubs dedicated to occult practices with tens and thousands of members. The embrace of the occult in Wilhelmine and Weimar Germany was ironically a relief from an anonymous irrational world. Modern-minded men and women sought to rectify their suffering under modernity's burdens through an embrace of the new occult sciences. We have to remember that Germany lost World War I, the new technology decimated an entire generation, so people were looking for alternative sources of knowledge. Moreover, it was often women who were believed to possess these powers, as is suggested by numerous academic and popular accounts from the period. Women assumed the role of healing the social and psychic crisis that resulted from the upheaval of traditional institutions. Order could be restored to a community if women could direct their supernatural powers to worldly matters. One concrete example of this was the use of female mediums by the police to solve criminal cases. And another example was the government's employment of Frau Wildhagen, who used the dowsing rod to detect toxic environmental elements. The popular belief in scientists such as Baron von Schrenck-Notzing, who set out to prove the validity of the supernatural, provided further legitimacy to these practices in the popular consciousness. Although it was believed that women's occult powers could restore the social order, supernatural activities were also regarded with suspicion. The ambiguous status surrounding occult practices mirrors the similarly ambiguous status of Weimar's emancipated woman. The term new woman was coined by the popular media to describe the emancipated role of women. Weimar women were forced to adopt a more independent outlook given the limited marital prospects resulting from the loss of 2 million German soldiers in the First World War. By 1925, nearly 36% of the German workforce consisted of women, with 12.6% of these workers engaged in the white-collar sector. Other notable markers of women's emancipation include suffrage and a significant decline in the birth rate, coupled with a rise in the age of marriage. Weimar women maintained their economic emancipation, holding positions as white-collar workers, civil servants, as well as being employed in more traditional jobs as domestic workers. Many married women also served as family helpers, working without pay for the family business. Weimar women were caught in between the desire to take part in modern opportunities and the pressures to revert to more traditional roles of wife and mother. Fear of the new woman was expressed both in the popular media and in academic journals in light of her rejection of traditional gender roles. There was a common reactionary sentiment across these wide-ranging publications that women should reestablish roles as housewife and mother in order to restore the family unit and the identity of the nation. The new woman thus occupied a transitional state in which she was at the same time challenging traditional gender roles and forced to conform to them. According to Weimar critic Heinrich Eduard Jakob, women who tried to attain the economic rights of man were responsible for taking part in the downfall of culture. The press in general asserted that women must not play ape to the male intellectual world, but must be content to be loved as a true woman and mother. Weimar critics commented on the interstitial state of woman as caught between her role in the public sphere and as a domestic servant. This in-between state ascribed to the Weimar woman created a situation in which women were attributed with spiritual powers deemed dangerous to society. Anthropologist Mary Douglas notes that when a social system assigns an ambiguous role to an individual or a group, the community often attributes spiritual powers to the disenfranchised. According to Douglas, to have been in the margins is to have been in contact with danger, to have been at the source of power. The feminine is often positioned at the margins, with woman possessing the power of the other, which is dangerous and must be held in check. The threat posed by the occult woman highlights the inevitable backlash that tempered women's advances in the social, political, and economic spheres. The scientific and popular perceptions of occultic practices parallels the need of the master narrative to cognize and constrain the irrational other. As Douglas suggests, the ambiguous other must be defined by a strict demarcation in order to preserve a social hierarchy. Just as the female spiritualist is both prophet and demon, the new woman participates in the masculine order, nonetheless remaining an outsider in the dominant discourse. Female vampires and the new woman. The sexually motivated female criminal, or Lustmörderin, is driven to suck the blood of her male victim as the ultimate statement of her emancipation over male dominance. Brittnacher contends that the Weimar female vampire is a paragon of the femme fatale character who threatens to destroy man. Bronfen notes that the vampire has escaped the realm of the dead by receiving vitality from sucking the blood of the living. The vampire's corpse is rejuvenated, and there is a need for a second death to assure that she does not pose a future danger to the community. The female vampire thus poses a specific challenge to men in her role as instigator and object of desire. The construction of the vampire's radical other positions her as a threat in the social order, demanding that she is extinguished and purged if male subjectivity is to be preserved. Barbara Creed observes that the female vampire's association is with bodily fluids, not only blood, but also in the tears of her victims. She further notes that the common features found in the vampire narrative include womb-like coffins, the full moon, snake-like fangs, 2 bite marks, dripping blood, and transformation. All menstruating women are in a cycle of continuous blood loss, a condition that naturally associates her with the need to destroy her or restore her deficient state. Despite its mundanity, Creed notes we are repulsed by the mere sight of our own blood, which leaves the subject with a sense of lacking wholeness or its proper state of being. In its association with fertility, blood is abject in its double status of signifying life and death. The female vampire is thus a border crosser who breaches the boundaries of the living and the dead, as well as the human and the beast. Her beauty is ageless, empowering her to seduce helpless men in their death. The ominous traits of the female vampire, this is The Trench by Otto Dix, 1920 to 23. The ominous traits of the female vampire may be understood as a cultural metaphor for the newly liberated and sexualized woman found in Weimar following World War I. The uncommon sight of blood becomes mundane on the battlefield, and the loss of life suffered in World War I is staggering. 2 million dead and 4 million disabled on the German side. Hans Heinz Ewers notes in his novel Vampire, 1921, that man must have blood to thrive following his wartime experiences. Quote, "They all want blood, blood. Humanity has become stricken with a wild fever and had to drink blood to make themselves well and young again." End of quote. The bloodletting of war is further linked to the new independent woman who realized an emancipated role in the security of the home front, while her male counterpart was left as a, quote, skeleton bereft of vitality. Writer and theater director Arnold Bronin noted that women tried on manly pursuits during World War I, while men in the trenches were fighting to protect female morals, and they did not change. The woman who was supposed to help the man integrate back into society after the war no longer existed. Returning home, it was reported that man found a type of woman who not only participated in traditional male employment, but also pursued male leisure activities, including sexual pursuits. These traits associated with the modern woman, namely her lack of concern for her male counterpart, brings to mind contemporary writer Stephen King's notion that the vampire is a symbol of sex without responsibility. The blood that was required by returning soldiers after World War I was rejected by the greediness of the new woman and her requirements to feed off the male realm of perceived freedom and pleasure. Bronin sums up the situation as he states, quote, "Nothing is more dismal than the life of these women, and nothing is greedier." In the following discussion, the vampire as sexual predator will be covered in the psychological and criminal treatises of the time period. The importance of blood is life-affirming as well as damning. This is from the film Vampire 1932 by Dreyer. And this is the young vampire who is, sort of sexually being aroused, but she has to stay in her bed because she's not getting enough blood. The importance of blood is life-affirming. It informs the contemporary discussion of the vampire. Vampiristic activity in a clinical sense may be influenced by the belief that blood is a vital life-giving symbol. The desire to be joined together with a deceased loved one, the sexual component of the vampire's bite or kiss as sadistic sexual expression, and importantly, the influence that Bram Stoker's novel Dracula, 1897, had on Western society. Stoker used research material from the British Museum in London, as well as from other sources, to draw up the myth of the vampire. In doing so, he formed a link with the psychiatry of the period, associating the state of insanity with vampirism, as well as reaffirming the sexual frenzy attached to drinking blood. The novel Dracula then becomes a reflection of psychiatry's relation to the vampire, and that was at the end of the 19th century already charted territory. The psychiatric investigation of women's relationship to vampiristic acts is evident in the case histories of the 19th and early 20th century. Physician and psychologist Havelock Ellis wrote in 1903 that the person who practices the love bite has the ultimate goal to shed blood, especially in the case of women who possess, quote, conscious desire, even with more or less restraint, to draw blood, a real delight in the process, a love of blood, end of quote. In a clinical example, Ellis notes a girl that was sexually stimulated by watching dogfights. She would also pierce herself in order to see and suck her own blood in a desiring act. She would bite her own husband in the act of lovemaking and suck his blood from him. Sexologist and psychiatrist Richard von Krafft-Ebing covers another case study from 1892 where a married man was found with various scars and scratches, offering up his tale of his vampiristic wife. When he wished to approach his wife, who was young and somewhat nervous, he first had to make a cut in his arm. Then she would suck the wound and during the act become violently excited sexually. Krafft-Ebing notes here that the wife's act is similar to the actions of vampires and believes that it is sadistic in nature. This act is also similar to clinical definitions of vampirism, as well as to the tale of Dracula, where Lucy, who grows more attractive in her undead state, feasts on blood to quench her lustful desires. Finally, American psychiatrist Benjamin Karpman cites in 1934 a bloody vampiristic fantasy. There are quite a few of these. I just chose a few of them. Entertaining fantasies about male lovers as well as her husband. The female patient yearns to chew their raw flesh but not swallow it in order, as she said, to get the taste of the blood. This woman also longs to pierce the heart of her female victim in order to drink her blood. Here, the drinking of blood is surpassed by the desire to kiss and subsequently eat various body parts, bringing to mind the notion of the kiss that's considered to have its roots in the cannibalistic act. Also, lesbian desire is an obvious element in this patient's fantasy, present in various narratives involving the female vampire and her female victim. Creed notes that lesbian desire of the vampire creates the, quote, most abject of vampire monsters. This is just an illustration of Le Fanu's novella Carmilla from 1872. It's one of the first vampire stories, and it predates Dracula by, I don't know, 25 years. And what's interesting about this is the female vampire has a friendship and loving relationship with her victim. So it's not the typical sort of aggressive relationship. This completely changes with Dracula and other subsequent tales. So it's an interesting beginning for our vampire tale in Western culture. Vampirism and the act of sexual murder, or Lustmord, are often paired together in criminal treatises of the early 20th century. Criminologist Eric Wolfen, in his mammoth work, Woman as a Sexual Criminal, 1923, discusses female lust and a desire to harm. Wolfen reviews the case of Caracella, a woman with strong sexual cravings for dead lovers. The accused from Cottbus supposedly removed a corpse, as well as murdered her two lovers, then roasted one of their hearts and ate it. In court, this woman looked like a mild-mannered individual, capable of following the law, her hands folded as if visiting a church. Those are Wolfen's words. However, the face of the sexual murderess also possessed the eyes of the demon, which gleamed ravenously. Also Wolfen's. I mean, this is a medical text. These are Wolfen's words. On the topic of necrophilia, or sexual excitement in contact with a corpse, Wolfen believes that women are not inclined to perpetrate this act. Quote, lustful women cannot revive the organ of a dead man. With regard to necrophagia, eating the flesh of the dead, necrophilia, and other types of lust murder, Prince notes that these terms have also come under the rubric of vampirism. Female vampires in Weimar fiction and film. This is the last section. Just as criminal vampires possess sexual ferocity and immoral actions, so too do the vampires of Weimar fiction and film expose a sexuality without moral or religious conviction. There is a move in fiction around the turn of the century from the film Fragile, who accepts the bite of the male vampire, to the femme fatale, who claims vengeance on the man in her quest for blood. Further characteristics of this female vampire include her hypnotic power and the fear of infection that she induces. Hermann Lunz's short story Vampire, 1920, features a medical student who is haunted by a half-blurred chalk-white face. This beautiful shadow with delicate features is a virginal young woman whom the student had admired in the past, but who had drowned suddenly. She comes in to claim her lover with the determination of the undead. Her erotic protestations, kiss my eyes, my mouth, my forehead, accept me, lead the young scientist first to cross-examine the reasoning behind her quest, and finally to succumb to her siren call. As he undresses, he experiences her, quote, ice cold leaden punch to his heart. He is then driven to re-experience the same sensations until he approaches his death, back broken, eyes burning, and head pounding. The vampire aims to draw blood from the heart in order to extract this life force from its source. Her actions promote a fear of death that is a key feature in vampire literature from the period, signaling an emasculation of the male protagonist. In Lunz's story, the male scientist is a first-person narrator, telling the story of his own demise. He is, however, powerless over his own outcome. A master of science and logical thinking, he is no match for the vampire's erotic desire. The female vampire character found in Lunz's short story also appears in Robert Wiene's film Genuine, 1920, an expressionist work in the fashion of Wiene's Cabinet of Dr. Caligari that creates a feeling of mayhem by utilizing surreal settings to evoke otherworldly sentiments. Just as a somnambulist in Caligari predicts death at the fairground, so too does Genuina the vampire evoke carnivalesque horrors complete with blue tinting to indicate madness. Venus spins a tale of a North African princess who feasts on blood and is transported to Ireland by Milo the explorer. Genuina's underground home is a hothouse filled with exotic plants. The two-dimensional stage sets create an atmosphere that's expressionistic in a nightmarish horror of tropical flora and fauna. The priestess is hemmed in by the jungle atmosphere, complete with birds on which she feeds. Her dress consists of huge plume feathers, exotic jackets, and harem pants. Unlike the vampire in fiction with their initial girlish appearances, this female vampire immediately presents as a lustful woman. Carl Mayer's script of Genuine provides a description of this supernatural woman. She is the spirit of this thing, without home, without destiny, without meaning. And her dark eyes suck out the secret of the young man's soul. The will melts, only the whiff of this skin, the smell of these hands, and the sweetness of this mouth. Furthermore, Genuina has done harm to the community. We may infer that she has drawn blood from the barber's nephew, the explorer himself, as well as the grandson. The urn of blood that we see at the beginning of the film must not be far away, as we observe Genuina giving commands to her servant, kill him and bring me proof. Her biting and kissing are tantamount to attack, and her actions have dire consequences for those around her, including the nephew who, kissed by the vampire, lives in the stupor of the village. It is only when the community hears about the strange happenings that they form a mob and attack the house. All of the occult symbols surrounding Genuina, the sun, the moon and planets, strange monstrous creatures and skeletons, evident in the stage sets, as well as the magic ring that controls the servant, are designed to protect her power, but in the end are no aid against the raging community. Her bird-like structure is invaded by the townspeople, her manservant is beaten to death, and finally the nephew spills her blood in the hallway as retribution for the blood she has extracted from others. So it's a conclusion. This is also from Vampire 1932, Dreyer's film, expressionist film. This is the old vampire crone called Marguerite Chopin. And it's interesting because this shot, she's looking into the coffin of the male protagonist, and she's made a little window where he can see out, but she can also see in. So she's checking up on him there. She's a very scary vampire. Okay, so the conclusion here. As may be seen in numerous depictions of the Weimar period, the occult woman is presented as a harbinger of danger and misfortune. The historical documents in the form of popular journal articles, scientific writings, art, and cinema all provide evidence of a preoccupation with women's role in the occult. If woman is a marker for historical crisis, as Kaja Silverman suggests, then the restoration of the civic order is predicated on understanding her secrets. The elusive woman, however, remains unknowable, dangerous in her role as gatekeeper between this world and the next. Promising to bring order through her engagement with the other world, the Weimar woman also casts a spell of death. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much.